Hello, everyone. So, it's just me right now. I'm Chris Weave. Welcome to Starfleet Tactical. Pat may be joining us later. Alec and Crystal finally moved into their new place, but they don't have internet yet, so they're not going to be having internet for a little while yet. So something like Tuesday or something like that. So they should be back online then. But until then, you've got me. Pat is currently at a hotel in, I believe, St. Louis, frantically trying to get his iPad to work to connect. Pat, as you know, is a working airline pilot, and he had to go flying today. So he's been doing, he's like in the middle of like a 3-city stop or something like that. But he should be joining us momentarily. In fact, speak of the devil, there he is. Hello, Pat. How are you?
Good. How's it going? Always in the nick of time.
Yeah. So how long have you actually been in your hotel room?
33 minutes.
Ah, okay.
So that's how long I've been. They don't give you the internet code so you can log on to the internet. Got to do that. Had to grab a bite to eat. And then, of course, my laptop, which never has any problems, of course, is not turning on properly and stuff. So don't know if that works, which it won't connect to the internet, and it wants to reboot, and it wants to update itself, and it can't find internet signal. So I'm on my iPad.
Okay. Well, that works. So far, so good. It seems to be working. So I just finished explaining that we don't have Alec tonight either because Alec, I did confirm with Lissa that Alec and Crystal did move this week, and the new place doesn't have internet connectivity yet. So Crystal's, Crystal and Lissa have their own show, and none of the shows have happened this week because they've been in the process of moving. So, so I'm glad that they finally got that move done. Well, to the degree that it's done when you've just moved in, right?
Yeah.
There's always that, where did I put my underwear sort of moment that you have after a move.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, we were a little bit late. We were a little bit late getting back in. So.
Okay. Any issues today? Was it a good day for flying?
Oh, it was a beautiful night. I got to chase the sunset. We were flying west, so it was fun.
Okay, that does sound cool. Maybe you can answer a question for me that I had. I was watching a video earlier today on AWACS, and one of the things that I know from all the time that I spent on aircraft carriers and stuff like that is that when you're flying off the ship, one of the first things that happens after you're off the ship is that they give a message back to the ship saying, like feet wet, 10 souls on board, right? So basically, if you end up in the water, they know when they need to keep, how many people they're looking for. Do you know, is there a land-based naval air equivalent of that? Or is that just a thing that they do with the carriers? Coming off a ship.
I don't know. I just know when they get over the land, I believe they call feet dry.
Yes.
But so yeah, beyond that, no, I couldn't answer the detailed procedural questions there.
Okay. One of the things that I find interesting, I find procedural stuff like that to be interesting. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that there's probably, you would expect to see a real world equivalent, or a real world equivalent. That is a real world equivalent. A science fiction equivalent of that, but it wouldn't necessarily be feet wet or feet dry. It'd probably be something like the space shuttle would do. The space shuttle on its launch would get to a point where it's NASA, so everything is in the form of an abbreviation, not an acronym unless it's pronounceable. But there was an abbreviation that translated as abort to orbit. It may have actually even been called ATO, abort to orbit. And so once you get to a specific point, you no longer have the option of landing on planet Earth without going into orbit first.
Okay. Yeah.
You can land on planet Earth. You just can't land on the dry parts.
It's almost enough. Yeah.
And as they're going up, they're constantly calling where you're aborting to next.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because there were a bunch of divert fields.
The general aviation equivalent to that when you're flying in a little single engine airplane is that if you've only got one engine, you need to know what to do when it stops. And this was a bigger deal, obviously, when you were, in the 40s, 50s, 60s, when your little single engine airplane could quit at any time. You're always, at least whenever I was flying single engine, I always knew exactly where I was going to land, what field I was going to aim at. So it's just a constant, check-in for the next farmer field to land in, or airport if you happen to be near one, or road, stretch of road.
So I worked with a Marine pilot
Mm-hmm.
When I was at the Naval War College, F-18 pilot. I did not know until his farewell lunch how he got his call sign. Because as you know, but other people might not know, if a naval aviator tells you a call sign and it sounds cool, he
gave it to himself.
Yeah, you know one of two things: either he's lying, or it actually isn't nearly as cool as it sounds. It just sounds like it's cool.
Yes. Yep.
And so this guy, his call sign was T-Bone.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought it was just because his last name started with T, and I could see him. They needed a call sign, so they called him T-Bone. He told the story about how he got the call sign T-Bone, and it turns out that he got that call sign because before he joined the Marines, he had his private pilot's license. He was a fairly inexperienced pilot. He had rented a Cessna, and he did not figure out that he was dealing with headwinds until he had reached the point where he wasn't going to be landing at an airport. Mm-hmm. And so he was like someplace in Texas. And so he did the divert to a farmer's field thing and managed to hit a cow with his airplane and kill it.
Nice. Very cool. Yeah, I heard once there was a light airplane that had crashed, ran out of fuel and crashed. And the fire chief was quoted as saying, "Well, it's a good thing there wasn't any gas in that plane, or they might have burned to death."
Yeah. That can happen.
So
that can happen.
So what are we talking about tonight?
Well, so I put together some slides. I mean, I've got my slide deck that I work on every time, and I've got a little bit more on. So we can certainly talk about that. I was trying to think if there was anything else that jumps out at me as a conversation that we should have before doing that. And I want to say that there was something that we were going to start with that we talked about. It was a gaming thing. There was some gaming story that we were going to start with this week. I'm trying to remember what it was. Because remember at the end, I had showed off that I was wearing my shirt that I got in the 70 or 80 person close action game. And I think you said something about having a story about some gaming event. And we were going to start with that. But if you're not remembering it, then we can just skip that and try to come back to it later.
I'm not thinking. I can't quite think of it.
Yeah, somebody said Jim Westbrook said, "Not as cool as it sounds. You mean like Maverick?" And it's like, yeah, that wasn't really.
Never met a Maverick.
Well, and the thing is that he didn't get that because he looked like James Garner. He got it because he was kind of out of control.
Right.
So, I used to work, since we're on the subject of Top Gun, I used to work with the person who was the model for Charlie.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so that was.
Trying to improve the lighting in my room.
Okay. So yeah, that was Christine Fox, who later ended up as acting Deputy Secretary of Defense a few years ago. But she was at the Center for Naval Analysis during that time period, the time period that I was there. And she had been the CNA advisor to Top Gun back when they got ready to make that movie. And as I heard the story, the original plan was for Charlie to be like a barmaid or something like that. And the actress who played her, whose name is escaping me right now, but it will come to me.
Kelly McGillis.
Kelly McGillis. Kelly McGillis said something like, they've done the sort of barmaid meets the fighter pilot thing before. Can't we make this woman, can't we make her a professional? And so the head of Top Gun said, let me introduce you to somebody. And that's how Christine Fox became part of it. And so by the time I met Christine, she was kind of over the entire story. Because it's one of those things that, she had been living with it her entire professional career. She was a fairly new CNA analyst when all that happened. But, made the cover of Smithsonian's Air and Space magazine and a few other things. So, but, oh, well. Well, thank you for the contribution, Joe. Do either of you have the golden hat from playing Starfleet Battles tournaments? That's really a question for Pat, because I've never played in a Starfleet Battles tournament. And truth be told, I've only played Starfleet Battles a couple of times and I was never any good at it.
Well, you wouldn't be. It takes 10 years to get good at it. Actually, it takes 10 years to get mediocre at it. But no, I never played in a Starfleet Battles. I mean, I played tournament stuff. Played a lot of tournament games online with various people. Whenever I was playing against the Sharks, who really, regularly were competitive at those Starfleet Battles tournaments, always got my ass handed to me. It wasn't, then Federation Commander came out, and that's the one I got fairly decent at.
Okay, that tracks. I heard that there were a couple of years there where the same guy that won the Starfleet Battles tournament was also the guy that won the Advanced Squad Leader tournament.
I couldn't speak to that. I do know that one of the guys that sometimes wins the Starfleet Battles tournament also, he was the only one that beat me on a regular basis when he played. So the skills did translate.
Okay.
Down to Federation Commander.
I can believe it. Ken Burnside tells a story about
this. Actually, I mean,
go for it.
His name was Paul, but he was a very good Starfleet Battles player. But I believe he was also a lawyer. So I'm assuming both lawyers and accountants do very well in that game.
I would expect so. I would expect so. Ken Burnside told me a story one time, which I haven't been able to verify from an independent source, that at a local game store someplace, there was the group of the group of Starfleet Battles players and the group of full thrust players. And there was a little, good-natured banter back and forth. And finally, at some point, there was this challenge where they decided they were each going to play the other's game. Right? And so the full thrust players come in and play Starfleet Battles, and they get their heads handed to them, as you would expect, right?
Right.
And then the Starfleet Battles players play the full thrust players, and the full thrust players get their heads handed to them.
I would expect as much. It is good training for thinking through complex situations.
Yes, and that's the thing that they did, is that if you're somebody who's into that kind of game, it does not reward somebody who just comes in and says, "Hey, let's see what happens." Right?
No, it does not. No, that game is all up here.
Yeah, so they got a copy of Full Thrust. They analyzed it to death. They figured out the optimal ranges. They did their probability tables. They did all the things that you do if you're taking something like that really seriously, and they just blew them away.
Yeah, Starfleet Battles isn't really, if you're playing at the tournament level and stuff, or even using most of the rules as a Starship combat game, you are it is not a casual game. Now, the basic mechanics of the game are very are pretty simple to start off with. It's not like you have to drop the the giant telephone book-sized rule book, and on day one. You don't do that. You play a Federation heavy cruiser against Klingon D7. You learn the charts and tables, which you just roll 6-sided dice. All you do is count the number of hexes, cross-index the die roll for that weapon with the range. Gives you some damage points. You mark off some boxes. The movement system's really not terribly complicated once you learn how to, once you basically learn how to do it. The thing about that game is but then once you start throwing in Romulans and cloaking devices and plasma torpedoes and enveloping plasma torpedoes and Gorns and Zinti and Lyrans and ESGs and disruptors and drones, and all of those rule interactions, while individually are all simple, creates a really complex soup. So it is. It's a really fun game. Maneuvering's important. When you shoot is important. What part of the other side guy's ship, as in what shield side you hit, is important. How you whether you concentrate or split your fire, all that stuff. So like I said, that's my foundation in a lot of ways for thinking of starship combat and stuff like that, and in Star Trek. And so on the times they've done it right, they're taking into account different shield sides and when to fire and all that kind of stuff. So
there's a lot of games out there that have a reputation for being big and complex that remind me a lot of Unix, actually. For those of you who are computer geeks out there, Europa's that way too. There isn't any part of Europa that's really that difficult. It's just there's so much of it. And it's not even that there's a lot of different special cases. It's just that the little pieces, you have to have all the little different pieces memorized. There's lots of little pieces. This is a game that, from a terrain perspective, differentiates between woody marsh and marshy woods.
Wow, that doesn't sound complicated at all.
Two different kinds of terrain features. And I think, if I remember correctly, they're the same except for like tanks. One of them is different for tanks or something like that. So it's kind of complicated.
Is it easier to hear me now? Is the sound any better?
A little bit easier. It does sound a little bit better.
Okay, good.
You weren't really bad before, but just a little bit off.
Somebody asked me to improve it, so I grabbed that. So here's one of my things about games, about especially when you have a complex game and stuff like that. As people play games, you learn a game, you like it, then you want a little bit more, you add a little bit more, you want an expansion to the game, and suddenly it's a real complicated game, which is what happened to Starfleet Battles. It was initially a pretty simple game. But
it was originally a folio game.
Yeah.
But
it just kept growing. Yeah, it just kept growing and growing. But what happens there is at some point the barrier to entry for that game is too high, and then 40 years later you just have a bunch of us 50 and 40 and 60-year-old guys playing the game still. But you don't have any new people going because you didn't want to downshift and train up a new generation of players and stuff. And I think that's too bad. I think it's important to have let's call it a gateway game.
and you can support that for a long time because, of course, your income levels are going up all that time, so people can buy more and more and more stuff.
Yep.
Public radio frequently has that same problem. Their donor base gets older. They're able to keep their numbers up, but then you sort of look at the demographics and go, eventually they're going to start dying.
They're all going to die. Yeah.
They're going to be in trouble.
Yep.
Yeah. So back when I was working at the Center for Naval Analysis, my good friend Mike Markowitz and we were a great design team together. Because Mike was always the guy that if you said, "Hey, we should probably do a game on such and such," he would come back an hour later and he'd say, "Okay, here's a map and here's some counters and here's this," and he just jumped on the grenade. But he would always get to this point where he'd want to start simplifying things. And one of my roles as the developer with working with Mike was it was my job to stop Mike from oversimplifying the game. Because the joke is that if you let Mike do it, he would build the game up, and then if you let him keep simplifying, eventually you'd end up with like a coin flip. And that's all. The entire game would be a single coin flip.
Right.
You always had to say, no, leave that in. You got to leave that in.
Yeah. And that's the real challenge, is coming up with those mechanisms and stuff that actually make it fun and interesting, even though it may not be super efficient, and then getting rid of the boring, inefficient stuff.
Yes. So Lissa wrote, I like public radio. I like public radio too, for the record. I really, really like public radio. In fact, it's really the only radio I listen to these days.
Yeah.
So, oh well. So should I do some slides?
Yeah. Why don't you, let's get on with it.
Okay. It's always good to have a little bit of a game conversation early on.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, somewhere I have slides. Okay, I need to shrink this part down, move it to the third monitor, move it up. There's all these things I have to do to sort of arrange things, because it's surprising that even with 3 monitors, how quickly you run out of space, especially since PowerPoint insists on taking 2 of them.
Right.
Somebody's asking what radio station I listen to, and the answer is I actually do it over the internet, and I forget which station it is, but it's a station in the Charlottesville, Virginia area, because that's what the local station was when I was there. And I picked that station mostly because it fits with my schedule. So I listen to the Saturday morning shows, start from 8 to 10, and then from 10 to 11, and that's what I do. Okay, so let's see. Let me do that. And then I will share screen. Okay, so you should be seeing my title. Yep, I'm seeing my title slide too. So I keep just dumping stuff into the same slide deck because at some point I want to do a write-up that goes along with it, with each of the slides, because this is interesting stuff. And so once again, one of the things that I'm always trying to accomplish with this stuff is I approach the intersection of the real world and science fiction from the standpoint of I try to use my knowledge of the real world to make science fiction more interesting. Because I think, the real world, they've solved some problems in the real world, and it highlights some of the things that might be problems in science fiction. And by problems in this case, I mean like humans are going to go do something, right? If you're going to have a Navy or a military go off and do something, there's certain things it's going to have to do. And so looking to real world examples to sort of explain how science fiction would make that work seems to be a natural to me. There are other places where you see it done the other way. For instance, I did a thing called NavyCon back in June, I think it was, beginning of June. Maybe it was beginning of July, one of the two. And NavyCon is people using science fiction to examine real world issues. We're doing another NavyCon on the 5th of November. I'm going to be producing it. I'm going to have the Lissa role. But I'm not actually presenting, because I kind of decided that it's not quite the thing that I do. The thing that I do is take real world expertise and apply it to science fiction, and oftentimes Star Trek in particular. So I've grayed out stuff that we've already talked about. If I decide to add more things to it, I'll put them back in as a non-gray thing. But right now they're sort of done. So let's go look at Winchell Chung's ship design triangle. I did that once, but I've since expanded it a little bit. This all comes from his Atomic Rocket Ships of the Space Patrol website, which if you haven't seen it, it's a national treasure. Winch is basically trying to grab everything he can stuff he's read, stuff people have said to him, et cetera, stuff he's researched about the subject of rockets and space travel and science fiction and all the rest of it, and sort of dump it into one great big website. And it's a tremendous resource for anybody who's interested in science fiction. For those topics in science fiction, there are lots of authors that go to it. And Winch has been working on this thing for 15 years now, I think. And it's just fantastic. So all of this comes from there. And so we kind of looked at this before. So the idea behind this particular chart, he was looking at the oft referred to trade-off in ship design between propulsion, weapons, or offensive capability and defensive capability. And by ship design in this case, I mean really sort of World War I-ish ship design. Right? So this is sort of the discussion that took place amongst the navies, the major navies of the world in the World War I timeframe. I have a tendency to sort of look at this from a British point of view, but I'll try to highlight when I'm saying something that doesn't apply to anybody else except the Brits. And Winch is very much into ways to capture this sort of information and make it available. And so he came up with this triangle graph in order to try to do that. Now, it gets hard if you've got more than 3 variables. If you got more than 3 variables, like squares really don't work. After triangles, you have to start doing it in 3 dimensions with one of the dimensions coming out. It really becomes a pain very quickly. But at this point, this actually really kind of works pretty well. And the idea here is simply that with some given assumptions that we're going to talk about later, you're really sort of directly trading off capability, because all that capability takes displacement, right? It takes mass, it takes weight of the ship. And so if you're limited, if you're going to build a 10,000 ton ship, you've got a 10,000 ton bag, and you can only put so much in that 10,000 ton bag. And so this is a good way of sort of capturing that. So go to the next slide. So in that last slide, you saw you ended up with 3 different sections that sort of gave that really sort of pointed towards what was the dominant feature in those sections. Winch goes on to sort of refine it further, and in the one on the left, he's really defining, he's listing them in order. So like in the light green one off to the left, when it says defense propulsion weapons, that's an area that has more defense than propulsion and more propulsion than weapons. And so you can sort of break it down so that it's very easy to see, you know what you're getting if you sort of look in that area. Well, but then you sort of get to the idea that maybe that's not entirely, you can probably refine it a little bit more, because, like, for instance, if you've got next to no propulsion, you really, a little propulsion doesn't help you much. You're not really a warship at that point. You might be just basically a fixed installation that's able to move a little bit. Like oil rigs have thrusters, but you wouldn't decide that an oil rig is actually a ship. It's really just something that floats there. It gets pulled around by a tug or one of those heavy lift ships. It's not really moving on its own, but it does have a little bit of capability to do that. You see the same sort of thing in some of the David Weber novels, the Universe novels. They've got these orbital forts that do actually have capability to move a little bit, because they have to stay in relative position and stuff. But that's they're not moving a whole lot, right? So
I seem to remember even in Star Trek in Deep Space Nine, DS9 could move. It had some thrusters, and that's, I believe, how it got near the entrance to the wormhole.
Yes, so, in fact, they extended a subspace field to lower the mass of it and then moved it.
Yes. Yes.
So, all right. So on the left, it's basically just sort of a pure thing. On the right, what he's done is sort of say, if you're at like the 5 or 10% level, if you're at the 5% level, it really doesn't count as being a capability. Okay, so.
One thing that occurs to me, I understand you can only have 3 sides.
Yes.
So it seems to me that one of those sides could be, like propulsion and endurance, fuel and, everything and supply, basically. The other one could be, weapons and defenses. And then the third one could be, research capabilities or non-combat capabilities.
Yes.
So that would make it a little more complex. Obviously, each one of those sides of the triangle would sort of factor in 2 separate things. But that's how you would just assign multiple capabilities to one of the triangles, to each of the triangle sides, if you had to have a more complex, fine-tuned triangle here.
Yeah, and the thing is that works if they are things that actually trade off that way.
Right.
Now, if you go to the webpage, you'll see that there's a little bit of a discussion with Ken Burnside, who makes the observation that he thinks that command and control should be included in endurance. And okay, so now you're at 5. And I haven't really, I must admit, I haven't played around with the Pentagon to see if you can make that work somehow. But now you're at 5 and you're doing trade-offs. And he gave like what he considered his optimal balance. And I remember that the optimal balance would include the command and control aspect would be like 2.5%.
Mm-hmm.
Dude, if it's only 2.5%, just roll that into offense.
Right.
Because that's really what that is. Right?
Yeah. So weapons would constitute sensors, the guns, the maintenance crews to keep the guns functional over time.
Yeah.
The sensors, the command and control, the training, whatever, all that stuff. Ammunition.
You really just need to make sure that whatever you're picking for your trade-off are things that you can sort of normalize into the same type of thing, right? And so that's one of the reasons why World War I ship design and up through World War II works really well for that, is because what you're really looking at there, tonnage works really pretty well. And designers did have conversations basically about where do you put the marginal ton, right? Mm-hmm. The next ton of capability that you get, where do you put that? And so from that standpoint, that's a very natural conversation. But it is important to understand that, like, you wouldn't want to design a ship this way. This is really sort of as an assessment tool more than it is as if I sort of move it a little bit in this direction, right? There's a lot of tools that fit in the capability of, they're perfectly good to sort of rate the ship after the fact. But if you designed it that way, if you use that as the mechanism to design it, you end up with something weird. Mm-hmm. So if you look at the one on the left is the same as the previous slide. I just copied it over because it's useful to have those terms there when comparing them to the ship types, which is on the right side. And that's a World War II ship typology. Winch describes it as his grade school understanding of World War II ships or something like that, which my response is that he's actually got a pretty good understanding of those ship types. And, if you look at it, you see that a cruiser is really kind of a ship that's kind of balanced in the middle. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah.
And then you end up with different types of ships end up in different different sections. One of the things that I find interesting is that if you look at it, scout ships and carriers end up kind of with the same sort of mix, right? Even though they've got dramatically different missions, they end up with the same sort of mix because they're both about propulsions and defense and not about weapons. Well, maybe, right? Because I think the right way to think of an aircraft carrier is its weapons are its airplanes.
Right.
Which incidentally is one of the reasons why carriers are so flexible, is that
But it's also their defense.
it's also their defense. Yeah. So, like I said, the system can sometimes break down in a few places. It to the degree that it aids in understanding, it's useful. When you start getting to some of the edge cases and it stops aiding in understanding, then the right answer is to not be slavish in your use of it. So okay, so let's see. I want to say there was something else I had in there. It's interesting how close torpedo boat and destroyer are to each other. I will frequently say that you ended up with the torpedo boat, which was intended to attack capital ships. They created a ship called the torpedo boat destroyer. And then in one of the great ironies of naval history, somebody said, hey, why don't we put some torpedoes on the torpedo boat destroyer? And it turns out a torpedo boat destroyer is a better torpedo boat than a torpedo boat is. And the reason for that, it has a lot to do with just stability in open waters. Torpedo boats are at their most effectiveness when they're in protected waters. When you get into the open ocean and you get lots of wave action, they're just not nearly as effective, for the reason that any small boat has problems when you go out in the open sea. The bigger the ship, the steadier. I can remember, of all the times I was at sea on aircraft carriers, I can remember about a day and a half where the weather really actually made a difference as to what the ride was on the aircraft carrier. There were lots of days on the destroyers and the cruisers where you could I'd be in a windowless room deep in the hull, and I could really sort of kind of tell what the weather was outside just by how much the ship is moving around. There was really only one day on an aircraft carrier where it was like that. So, okay, let me go to the next slide. So this compares. So the previous slide was basically Winch looking at World War II stuff. He included another website and some ship types that come from that website. Now, I will admit, I've discovered this website a couple of times, but I've never had a chance to really go through it in any detail. But I find it an interesting enough site when I sort of dipped my toe in that I decided to go ahead and pull this slide in. I need to really spend more time going through it. I can't really say that I've got a really good understanding of it. But I figured that I would put it in the slide deck and I would talk about it long enough that anybody who's watching this would be able to type in that URL and go take a look at this site. So basically, this guy was designing his own universe. He uses the term space elves, so that's a thing. But it looks interesting. It looks like he kind of has his act together, and I'm looking forward to doing that a little bit more. All right, so a few further observations on all this. There's a lot of things that this particular graphic doesn't take into account, and we talked about a few of them. So, like, it doesn't take into account cargo capacity, right? Or in the case of a carrier, it really doesn't take into account the air wing. Kinda, like we talked about. It can fit under offense and defense, etc. But you could also sort of view them as being cargo, and it doesn't really take into account cargo stuff. It doesn't really take into account endurance. And if you look at, for instance, the German High Seas Fleet versus the British Grand Fleet, those were ships that had dramatically different endurance, dramatically different doctrine in terms of where they thought they were going to fight and how they designed the ships to fight there, right? The German force was really intended. It was a garrison force. It did not patrol on a regular basis, and by that I mean when they weren't out on a specific mission, they were in port. They weren't doing things like the U.S. Navy does now, which is show the flag missions. We're just going to go hang out in the Persian Gulf and just be a force for good in the Persian Gulf. They didn't do stuff like that. They were really designed to only operate in the North Sea with a very specific enemy in mind. Yeah, I guess they could shoot at the French also, but they were really there to shoot at the Brits. And so that's really the right way to think about those guys. And this graphic doesn't take any of that into account. Doesn't take into account the level of technology on a ship. One of the things that people don't necessarily understand is that as armor improved from like the, say, 1880s to 1910, as armor improved, it did not really get more effective. What it got was lighter. You could get an equivalent amount of protection with less steel, and as a result, you spent a lower percentage of your total on protection. So ships got bigger, they got more guns, they got more of a capability to hit at long range, which put a premium on armor, which it also changed the locations that you'd want to have that armor on, because the angle of the shell hitting the ship changed over time. And none of those things are taken into account in this graph, but they're all important. Doesn't take into account the size of ships, doesn't take into account the politics that goes along with it. So a given design, you can pick an area in that chart and you can say, I want to build one of those, but it may not be the right thing for you. You may not have the technology really to make it work right. Like if your propulsion technology isn't very good, you might end up with something that's way too slow to be used. If you might have incompatible doctrine. So like if you're buying German ships, but you need to think like the Brits because you got the same sort of problems as the Brits, it might not work. The Brits, had a global empire. They designed their ships so that they could send them halfway around the world with a lack of shipyard facilities where they had to basically do most of the maintenance themselves, and they could just sort of hang out and do their thing. And, with sort of rudimentary port facilities where they were. The Germans were the exact opposite of that. You might have an incompatible strategic or tactical situation. You just may not have the option of trying to do the thing that those particular ship designs are really optimized to do. And, the world has changed, so maybe the ship design did work then, but it's not really something that makes a whole lot of sense now. The reason, for instance, why the U.S. This doesn't really work for modern ships because the nature of protection has changed. We moved away from heavy armor on our ships because first, nuclear weapons, and second, precision-guided missiles. And our conclusion was it's not worth trying to armor them because if they lob a nuke, no amount of armor we're going to put on is really going to save you from a nuke. So you needed to prevent that nuke from landing via other mechanisms. Part of that is fleet dispersion. Part of that is electronic countermeasures. Part of that is getting the other guy before he gets you. Yes, Pat.
So I was just wonder if you can talk about. So you said no amount of armor is going to prevent you from, or save you from the nuke.
From a direct hit.
From a direct, right. So how much of the fact that, okay, we're in the missile age, we want to lob missiles at each other, but what if we had armored the ships to where just a standard anti-ship missile might not have worked that well or been that ultimately that effective when you can shoot down some of those missiles? Could that have led somebody into deciding, well, we just have to use nukes because standard missiles don't work? I didn't know if that worked the other way around, if that was...
Yeah, and we think that the Russians pretty much were intending to go nuclear sooner rather than later. Elmo Zumwalt, when he was chief of naval operations, he pushed an idea of having sort of a high-end garrison force and a lower-end deployed force, because we need to go and patrol, we need to deploy, we need to show the flag, we need to exercise sea control. But his expectation was we were going to lose all those ships at the beginning of the war because they were going to get nuked.
Mm.
And then we were going to end up fighting the war with what we had left. And so his idea is, if we think we're going to get nuked at the beginning of the war and we're going to lose all that stuff, let's not make it the good stuff. Let's make that stuff a little cheaper.
How would they have protected the, quote, garrison force?
Garrison force was going to be back in the United States, and the idea was that we protect those guys through the form of mutual assured destruction. If the Russians want to start popping off, if they pop off a nuke over Naples,
mm-hmm.
or over ships at sea in the Med, that's a different story than popping off a nuke over Norfolk.
Ah.
And so the idea is, you start getting into intra-war deterrence issues and issues along the lines of escalation dominance. I mean, that was a big theme back during the Reagan administration. The idea was we had to have escalation dominance, which meant that we had to be able to win the war at whatever level the Russians chose to fight at. So we beat them at a conventional level. If they decide to go to tactical nukes, we beat them at the tactical nuclear level. If they decide to go to theater nukes, we beat them at the theater nuclear level. If they decide to go to strategic, we beat them at the strategic level. And the entire idea behind that is you don't ever want to present somebody with an incentive to escalate. And if the Russians think that if they escalate, they're still going to lose and they're just going to kill more Russians in the process, then they will be incentivized to not escalate.
How you incentivize your opponent is a big thing. That's part of the four-dimensional chess thinking.
Yes. And there was a time in my life where I wasn't a naval guy; I was a nuclear guy.
Okay.
Back in college, I used to read Colin Gray for fun.
Did you ever read The Last Ship?
No, I haven't. I didn't read The Last Ship, and I haven't seen the TV show. I just looked at some of the pictures of the CIC on the web.
Yeah.
I never got into the survivors after it's all over aspect. I mean, I very briefly went through a phase where I read some books about that, but that wasn't really kind of the world I was interested in. I'm more interested in Star Trek type world than I am in a world that looks like that.
Yeah. It felt like a lot of the last 20 years, a lot of the sci-fi always involved a dystopian future or post-apocalyptic future, and like at some point that gets a little bit old. At least for me. It's just never been my favorite thing either.
Yeah, and it's like I'm on a couple of lists that send me new books when they come out because people are constantly running book deals. And so I'll click on the link and I'll look at the explanation, and when I get to the word post-apocalypse, I close the tab.
Yeah.
I'm just not interested.
Right.
And everybody and their brother seems to want to write post-apocalyptic fiction, and I'm just not interested. Usually, I mean, I've waxed poetic about Andromeda, Gene Roddenberry's Andromeda, which is, it's post-apocalyptic, but it's not guys living in tents in the woods trying to put Earth back together.
Yeah,
it's not it's not Hunger Games. It's not any of that crap. It still gets to be spaceships being spaceshipy.
Yeah, and captains doing captainy things.
Yes, exactly, exactly. So, okay, so that's what I got for the triangle graph. But I'll conclude with the last bullet I've got here. The graph isn't the answer itself. It'll help you sort of understand the answer. And, I like what you said, Pat, about how you could, different ways you can do it, because I don't think these three like that work for Star Trek, for instance. And this is, you can look at this as being organizational dependent. I mean, I would think that with Starfleet, you would have one thing that's offensive and defensive capability, another thing that is probably exploration capability, and then the final thing is probably, it might be endurance and propulsion, although that might be implied by the exploration stuff. There's some interesting things there, and at some point we need to have Andy on.
Yeah,
because Andy and I have been talking about, like, what's the difference between the Reliant and the Enterprise in Wrath of Khan? Why would you've got these two different ships? If you look at the Reliant, you'll if you really sort of do a volumetric look at it, you come to the conclusion that it actually is a bigger ship than the Enterprise is.
Reliant actually has a little more interior volume, at least based on the some of the guys who have done volume analysis on it and stuff. Yeah. So one thing I'm struck by is, and this is what Andy had said, but if you look in lower decks, the California class starship, he's kind of the opinion that is kind of the Miranda class, of the late 24th century, because it's doing the second contacts, and it's doing the maintenance, the backbone work that keeps the Federation going and stuff like that, or it's doing a lot of, maybe it's doing a lot of Starfleet's Coast Guard type functions. They're not out on the fringes doing the exploration and that kind of thing, because when we first see the Reliant in Star Trek II, what are they doing? They're all bored out of their mind. They've been assigned to the scientists who just have them bouncing around, going to these lifeless rocks, but they find a microbe and then they can't do anything. And then they got to go find another one. And if you read the novel, it really hits home that everybody's bored out of their skull. So since we don't have that many other Mirandas, or, sometimes they're called Avenger class frigates, since we don't have too many other examples of this, it appears that, that might be why they're used. And one of the things Andy pointed out was the designer's intent of that Miranda class was to be a buoy tender, navigational buoys, that kind of stuff, maybe subspace relays, they're the guys so they're probably going around doing a lot of the maintenance work, but they are armed well enough that they can still challenge a Katinga class cruiser and stuff. They're still an armed ship. They can still provide the defense function for Starfleet, but one of the theories is that we don't see a deflector dish, a navigational deflector dish, which maybe means, it doesn't go quite as fast as, say, a Constitution class ship, or, the Enterprise, the motion picture Enterprise, or what we see from all of the Explorer classes is a primary and secondary hull. So there must be a reason for it. And the idea is that perhaps that secondary hull with the big deflector dish lets it go faster, which means it's better for out there in exploration and that sort of thing. So it's probably not, so the interior volume is not necessarily the primary thing. And if you look in the back of the Miranda class or the Reliant, it's got two big hangar bay doors. So it probably has a good number of shuttles, which can also be used, that gives you some versatility in situations and in star systems where the transporters don't work well. So
the other thing that differentiates them, the Constitution from something like the Miranda, is the fact that you've got a primary hull that you can detach and use as a lifeboat. And so when you sort of add all that stuff up, Explorer type ships can go faster. They don't have their warp core, their matter antimatter stuff, like right next to the people part. And they're better equipped to deal with a shipborne emergency of the sort that you might run into out on the periphery, and you're going to have to just basically hunker down and hang out for a while until somebody comes looking for you.
And the other thing about the Miranda class I'd like to point out is, it's got those 2 photon torpedo tubes forward and 2 photon torpedo tubes aft. So it's got forward and aft weaponry, and those Gatling phasers on the side of the Miranda. It appears that both the little nozzle that shoots out of the front, there's a similar equivalent nozzle that shoots out the rear. So it's got forward and aft weaponry, which would make it a really good escort, say in situations where cloaked vessels might start appearing out of nowhere and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So in that sense, it's probably in combat would make a pretty good escort, whether you're escorting a convoy or you're helping cover a Constitution class cruiser who happens to have all of its photon torpedoes facing forward and most of its weapons, in more of a forward direction, but it's only got a few light phasers in the back, or some phasers in the back, but not necessarily the heavy phasers. So that would, that gives the Miranda quite a bit of versatility.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I said, this chart changes over time. The sort of the utility of it changes as sort of doctrine changes and technology changes.
Well, you can change what you measure with it.
Right, but I mean, what I was gonna say is that you can sort of make the same type of observation with regard to Federation Starfleet doctrine over time, right? And it would be interesting to, and some people have kind of come pretty close to doing this, right? But I haven't seen anything that specifically fit out this way, of what ship types were being built at a given time, what their attributes were, and what we think the doctrine was, and sort of what the events were that were influencing ship design, right? Mm-hmm. So you end up with, over time, you end up with more things that look like pure warships, right? There's this time period from like the end of the movie era, the TOS movie era, to next gen, where time of peace, heavy influence, heavy emphasis, on exploration, things like that. And then you start getting pure warship designs as you have first the Borg and then second the Dominion to have to worry about. And so, they say lots of things about like the Sovereign class is a flattened design because that makes it harder to hit. Really? How many times do we see phasers miss? How many times do we see these weapons miss? I don't think it has anything to do with it being harder to hit. I think it has something to do with the effective perimeter of the shields being tighter. So I've got X amount of energy that I'm putting into my shields. I could have that be spread out over a big area, or I could have it spread out over a small area. Let's make it a small area. So it's not about being harder to hit. It's about being able to effectively make it thicker.
Well, and the other one is if you look at the neck of a Constitution class cruiser as a vulnerability, then that gets rid of that by eliminate the neck and just attach the saucer to the main second hull.
The good news of a Constitution class neck is that it breaks apart when you want it to. The bad news is that it might break apart when you don't want it to.
Yeah, exactly.
And those pylons.
I have to say, Enterprise took a hit from in the neck from the Reliant at nearly point blank range with those phasers, and unfortunately it killed that poor guy in the torpedo room when the airlock blew. But it didn't chop off the saucer or anything. So again, I think, strong hull. Some might argue that Reliant wouldn't have been firing full phasers. That would be a discussion worth having, I suppose, for fear of, hey, I'm at point blank range. If I blow up the Enterprise now, I'm going to get killed in the explosion too, because we're in a gaseous nebula.
But I got shields.
I'm not sure Khan gave a damn. But anyways.
So I got one slide here. I mentioned previously at one point the 1975 USN ship reclassification. And it occurred to me, I talked about it a little bit, it occurred to me that putting a slide together would actually probably help. The reason why this is important is, or at least why I think it's important, is that what ended up happening is the U.S. Navy changed the designation on some ships, and they did this in 1975. Star Trek, of course, ended in 69, if I remember correctly.
68, I believe.
68.
Season 1 was 66.
So
66, like 67.
67, 60. So 66, 67, 67, 68, 68, 69, I think.
Yep. 69.
So it ended before the moon landings, but it was like it ended in the spring, if I remember correctly. Okay, so so basically, up until 1975, this is what if they were going to base it off the modern U.S. Navy, this is what people like Franz Joseph and Gene Roddenberry, et cetera, would have to as a model, right? And I think Franz Joseph used it. I think that FASA used it for reasons that I'll get into in just a minute. So it's actually pretty simple. It used to be that for you had basically, not including aircraft carriers, but for other ships that were supposed to be part of the task force, you had cruisers, and then you had a destroyer leader that was also called a frigate, and then you had destroyers. So cruisers were the big ones, the medium ones were the frigates, small ones were destroyers. And then you had some escort stuff there also, and it kind of got a little squirrely with patrol frigate and stuff like that. Then they changed those designations, and basically, because nobody else on planet Earth did it this way. Everybody else, a frigate was a ship that was smaller than a destroyer. We were the only ones that had a frigate as a ship that was bigger than a destroyer. And so we basically did a total reset. Cruisers became cruisers with a slightly different, or oftentimes the same designation. Destroyers stayed destroyers. But those destroyer leader frigate classes, if they were big, they got to be a cruiser. If they were small, they got to be a destroyer. Most of them became cruisers. The smaller ones became DDGs. And as I put here, it fixes the cruiser gap through administrative action. We don't have enough cruisers. Oh, I can fix that with the surplus cruisers.
That's right.
And one of the things to keep in mind is that, through the 1960s especially, we built a huge U.S. Navy in World War II. And so all those World War II ships were around through the 1960s. Like, we weren't building destroyers until we really only started building destroyers in the 60s again, because we just had these surplus ships in World War II. Frigates were a little, the convoy escorts got turned into frigates, and they also got simplified in that at this point, we about the time we started building the Fig 7 class of frigates, the Oliver Hazard Perry class. So the original series and Franz Joseph all did their work in this pre-1975 world where they were going to be looking at that left-hand column if they wanted to be modern, right? That's the reason why they called it the Enterprise. The Enterprise was the newest ship in the fleet at the time. It was to the degree that the United States had a fleet flagship, that's what it was. FASA and Starfleet Universe were both kind of extensions of Franz Joseph. FASA had these interesting frigate designs that were the size of, that were basically in between ships, but they had lots of Starfleet Marines on board. So they were basically, you can think of them as, they were basically a cruiser that had a Marine complement, and they were actually closer to being cruisers in size. They threw all that out for Next Generation. They threw all that out for Star Trek SO, which is my favorite version of Star Trek, the Sternbach-Okuda version of Star Trek. And this obviously doesn't, there's a lot of ship types that aren't included in all of this. So one of the things that we're not going to get to, because we've reached our time and we should probably let Lissa go, But one of the things that I've added to the deck and we'll talk about in the future is something called the Glossary of Naval Ship Types. And the GNST, which is the document that's put out by the U.S. intelligence community that describes what foreign warships look like, what their designations are, right? So this particular ship is, we call it a cruiser because O&I says we're going to call this a cruiser. And in some instances, it does that. It doesn't, it doesn't match what they call it. Like the Chinese are building something they call a destroyer, and we go, well, that's really big for a destroyer. We're going to call it a cruiser. And the U.S. Navy doesn't follow that same schematic, right? We have our own classification scheme that we use for ourselves, and there's a classification scheme that we use for other people's warships. Our ship designations can be used due to politics. I mean, politics affects it. I talked about the cruiser gap situation. Same is true of foreign countries. They will sometimes call something because of a similar situation. Like at one point, the Brits, about the same time we were declaring stuff to be cruisers that we had previously called to be destroyers or destroyer leaders, the Brits were in the process of taking stuff that they had previously called, I want to say it was destroyers, and they were calling them frigates because they were trying to get across the idea to the British public that they were being frugal. And so they were actually downplaying the size of their ships rather than upplaying them, which is just totally baffling because it was exactly the opposite of what was going on at the time. So I think that's it for me for this evening.
All right.
Pat, what do you got? You got anything else?
No. Look forward to seeing everybody next week, and Chris and I will talk this week and come up with an interesting topic for next Saturday. Looking forward to it, though.
Yeah, that and we should have Alec back by then, because if they really do get internet connectivity on Tuesday, then
I believe next Saturday is Halloween, though, isn't it?
yes.
Next Saturday is Halloween,
All
so
right. Very good.
It might be more accurate to say that.
It will be Alec if that is the case.
Well, it might be more accurate to say that in another timeline they'll be having Halloween.
people will still be celebrating Halloween. I will still be celebrating Halloween.
Yeah, I think it's going to happen in our timeline.
So
All right.
I'll be there. I'll be there. All right, everybody. Thank you very much. I just copied the chat. So I'm going to try to go through and do what I always do and go through the chat and look and see if there's any questions, etc., that I need to pass on or respond to. I'll try to get that up tomorrow.
All right.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Good
Pat,
night, everyone.
have a safe day in the air tomorrow.
Thank you. I will.
You're going home tomorrow?
No, I go home Monday.
Oh,
So
yeah.
I fly around. I end up in Duluth, Minnesota tomorrow, so I expect it to be cold. And then Monday afternoon, fly home.
Well, have a safe flight,
Thanks.
and I'll talk to you guys all later. Thank
All
you
right.
very much,
Good night,
everybody.
everybody. See you.
Good night.
Bye-bye.